In the village of Zango, there was a woman named Salima. She was as poor as the dusty ground beneath her feet. His clothes were like old rags, full of holes and tears, barely covering his body. His heart was more like a shell than a home. The roof leaked whenever the sky cried, and the cold wind blew through the torn windows as if mocking her. Salima had no bed. He slept on the hard floor, curling up like a starving cat to keep warm. Every night she prayed for a better life, but the mornings always greeted her with the same struggle. She tried everything to survive. She fetched water for the people, washed their clothes, and even worked on their farms. But no matter how hard she tried, his hands always came back empty. It was as if the world turned its back on him. Her friends, the women she grew up with, were all married, living comfortably with their families. They wore fine clothes, and their children laughed and played around them. But Salima had no husband, no son, no one to call her own. The villagers whispered behind her back. "She is cursed," they said, "born with bad luck." Even the men kept their distance, fearing that his misfortune would be transferred to them. Salima's life was a story of sadness. She walked through the village like a shadow, unnoticed, unloved, and unwanted. Yet, despite everything, she persisted, hoping that one day the sun would shine more brightly in her life. But that day had not yet arrived. One hot afternoon, Salima took her bucket of tattered clothes to the river. The sun burned fiercely, and the river glittered like a pan of molten silver. She knelt at the water's edge, rubbing her rags with hands as rough as the village roads. The sound of running water was the only comfort she had. As she washed, she heard the soft rustle of footsteps behind her. He turned quickly, his heart jumping like a frightened bird. There stood, erect and proud, a woman dressed in clothes so fine they looked like they belonged to a queen. Her skin glowed, her jewelry sparkled, and her smile was sharp as a knife. "Good morning," said the woman, her voice as soft as honey. Salima blinked, unsure if she was dreaming. "Good morning, ma'am," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman approached. "My name is Kai. I've been watching you, Salima. I know about your struggles." Salima's eyes opened as the stranger knew her name. Kai smiled, as if he could read her thoughts. "I have a business for you. It's simple, and it will change your life." Salima stood still, her mind spinning. What kind of business would this be? Kai reached into her purse and pulled out a bundle of crinkled bills. "You will collect used panties from the villagers. Bring as many as you can. I will pay you handsomely for each load." Salima's jaw dropped. "Panties?" he asked, confusion heavy in his voice. "Yes," Kai said firmly. "Don't ask questions. Just do as I say and you will never be poor again." With that, she handed Salima the money and turned to leave. "Remember," she said, "I'll be waiting." Salima sat by the river, holding the money, her mind clouded with questions. What kind of business was this? Why panties? She didn't understand, but the weight of the money in her hand was real, and for the first time in her life, hope began to rise in her chest. She packed her clothes and returned home, her heart beating like a drum. What would she do next? The next morning, Salima woke up with a plan. He knew that the villagers might be suspicious if he only asked for panties, so he decided to make his trade visible. With the money Kai had given her, Salima went to the market and bought colorful buckets and bowls, large and small, each shining in the morning sun. When he returned to the village, he knocked on the first door. An old woman opened it, narrowing her eyes at Salima. "Good morning, Mom," greeted Salima, holding a bright blue bucket. "I'm trading these for old clothes, shoes, or even underwear you don't need." The old woman grumbled. "Old clothes, shoes, panties? What kind of business is this?" "It's for a new venture," said Salima, her voice firm. "If you have anything you're not using, I'll trade it for this pretty bucket." The old woman's eyes lit up when she saw the bucket. Without hesitation, she went in and returned with a pile of old clothes and shoes, covered by some worn-out panties. Salima smiled. "Thanks, Mommy. Here's your bucket." In each house, it was the same thing. The villagers eagerly handed over their useless items by Salima's shiny buckets and bowls. By the end of the day, her bag was full, overflowing with clothes, shoes, and most importantly, panties. That night, Salima sat in her hut organizing her collection. She carefully separated the panties and placed them in a special bag. The other clothes and shoes he took outside and burned them in a hidden place near the river. The flames crackled, consuming the evidence as Salima watched, her face illuminated by the firelight. The next day, she handed the bag of panties to Kai by the riverbank. "You did well," Kai said, her voice smooth as silk, handing Salima a thick wad of cash. Salima's heart lifted as she held the payment. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling hope rise in her chest. Kai smiled, his eyes piercing. "Keep working, Salima. Your life is about to change." And so, Salima's trade continued, each day bringing her closer to a life she never thought possible, while the villagers remained oblivious to the dark secret hidden beneath her newfound success. It didn't take long for the news about Salima's trade to spread through the village like wildfire. Their colorful buckets and shiny bowls became the talk of the village. From the elderly grandmothers to the youngest brides, everyone was eager to exchange their old clothes, shoes, and most of all panties, for Salima's fine products. "Have you seen Salima's new bowls?" a woman asked her neighbor. "Yes, I exchanged my husband's old shirts yesterday and got one." "It's beautiful," replied the neighbor, her eyes shining with excitement. Whenever Salima arrived at the village with her buckets, a crowd would instantly gather, with the women pushing and shoving away, each trying to hand over her old items first. Salima was never without customers, and her bags were always full at the end of the day. With Kai's payments arriving regularly, Salima's life began to change. She fixed her leaking roof, replacing the old one with sturdy palm fronds. Its windows were boarded up, preventing the cold from entering at night. She even bought new clothes, bright and colorful, like the women she once envied. For the first time, Salima could eat well. There were no more beggars or fights. Their days of hunger were over. The villagers noticed her transformation and began to comment. "See Salima," they whispered. "She's no longer the wretch we knew. Maybe her trade really is blessed," added another. But while his days were filled with laughter and negotiation, his secrets carried a darker shadow. When the village slept, Salima silently gathered her bags of sorted panties. Like a shadow, she crept along the narrow paths towards the river. Under the moonlight, she found Kai, who always waited for her with his strange and knowing smile. They exchanged no more than a few words, but each time, Kai took the bag of panties and handed the payment to Salima. No one in the village knew about these night meetings. To the villagers, Salima's success was just a simple story of hard work, but in the darkness by the river, something strange and unspoken was happening, and soon it would draw the attention of a keen eye. Salima's trade grew more than anyone in the village of Zango could imagine. She did not limit herself to her village, began to visit the neighboring villages, their buckets and bowls shining like the morning sun. Wherever he went, villagers gathered eagerly, preparing their old clothes, shoes, and underwear, waiting for his next visit. "Salima is coming tomorrow," they said, excitement bubbling like a pot of soup. Everyone wanted a piece of his trade. Back in Zango, his life was a miracle. His heart, once broken, was now strong and proud. His clothes were fresh and his meals were satisfactory. But while most of the villagers celebrated their success, one person's mind was restless. Her neighbor Tinu always had a watchful eye and could not ignore the strange pattern. Every night, while others slept, Salima took her bags and disappeared into the darkness. She returned hours later, her face calm, but her eyes told a story that Tinu could not understand. "Where is she going?" thought Tinu. One night, curiosity got to her hard. She wrapped herself in a thick shawl and waited by her window, watching Salima. As expected, Salima walked out of her hut, a heavy bag slung over her shoulder, moving like a silent cat. Tinu followed her, keeping a safe distance. The air was cold, and the night was eerily silent. Tinu's heart pounded in her chest, but she moved forward, hiding behind trees and bushes. Finally, they reached the river. Tinu crouched down, peering through the tall grass. His eyes widened when he saw a figure sitting on a large rock on the riverbank. It was Kai, her rich clothes shining faintly in the moonlight. All around her, candles flickered, their flames dancing in a perfect circle. Salima walked over, throwing her bag in front of Kai without a word. Kai opened the bag, pulling out only her panties, while the rest of her clothes were pushed to the side. Then Kai began to sing, his voice low and rhythmic like the buzzing of bees. The air around him seemed to thicken. Tinu's heart stopped as he watched Kai raise her hands, and suddenly the panties disappeared into thin air, leaving behind a faint, unearthly glow. A strange laugh echoed in the night, sending shivers down Tinu's spine. His legs were shaking and his heart was beating like a drum. She wanted to run, but her feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. What had she just witnessed? Who was this Kai, and what was she doing with the villagers' panties? Fear gripped Tinu as she silently retreated, her mind in a frenzy. She had seen enough for one night, but she knew this was just the beginning of a terrifying truth. Tinu's heart beat like a trapped bird as she stumbled back through the dark forest. The river's strange laughter still echoed in her ears, and every rustle of leaves felt like a hand reaching out to her. She clutched her shawl tightly, moving her feet as fast as she could, but the weight of fear made her legs as heavy as stone. She didn't stop until she got home, slamming the door loudly. Then he locked it and leaned against the wood, panting. The shadows in his room seemed to stretch and move, and the silence was deafening. Tinu sat in the corner, his knees drawn to his chest, his eyes scanning the room. Sleep refused to come as his mind replayed the scene by the river, the candles, the chanting, the disappearing panties, and Kai's haunting laugh. She hugged herself tighter, whispering prayers softly, begging for the night to end. At the first ray of morning light, Tinu could bear it no longer. She threw on her clothes and ran straight to the elder's house, her bare feet slapping against the dirt paths, kicking up dust as she ran. When he arrived, the elders were just waking up, their faces marked by sleep and age. But the panic in Tinu's eyes drove away all drowsiness. "What's the matter, Tinu?" asked one of the elders, his voice thick with concern. "It's Salima," Tinu shouted, his words tumbling over each other. "She goes to the river every night. There's a woman, Kai, doing something dark with our clothes. I saw it with my own eyes." The elders exchanged uneasy glances. "What did you see?" asked another elder, leaning forward. Tinu took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "There were candles! Kai was singing. She took only her panties and then they disappeared. And then there was laughter, evil laughter." The elders remained silent, their faces becoming more serious with each word. Finally, one of them stood up. "This is a serious problem. We must summon Salima immediately." The village bell was rung, its sharp clang waking everyone up. Men, women, and children quickly gathered in the square, murmuring among themselves. "What is happening?" they asked, their voices full of confusion. When Salima arrived, her face was calm, but her eyes were worried. The elders stood before the crowd, their expressions grim. "Salima," the head elder began, "your neighbor Tinu has brought a troubling report. She says she followed you to the river last night and saw things that compromise the security of this village. We demand an explanation." The crowd fell silent, all eyes on Salima. The air was thick with tension, and even the slightest breeze seemed to carry whispers of fear. Salima stood in the center of the village square, her legs shaking like leaves in the wind. The villagers' eyes fixed on her, their faces a mixture of fear and anger. She swallowed hard, but her throat was as dry as the Harmattan wind. "Salima," said the old man again, his voice sharp. "Speak. What are you hiding?" Salima looked down, her hands clasped tightly together. "I can't," he whispered. "I swore an oath. If I speak, I will go mad or die." Gasps ran through the crowd. Whispers grew like a hive of bees. "An oath? What kind of oath?" The elder frowned and turned to one of the young men. "Bring the priest." The villagers waited in intense silence until the priest arrived, his long staff thumping against the ground with each step. His sharp, knowing eyes scanned the crowd before settling on Salima. "You swore an oath," said the priest, his voice deep and commanding. Salima nodded, tears streaming down her face. The priest raised his staff and began to sing. His voice rose and fell like the waves of a river. The air became thick and a strange stillness dominated the square. The villagers watched in awe as the priest's chants seemed to wrap around Salima like an invisible rope. Finally, the priest stopped and pointed his staff at her. "Now speak," he said. "The spirit will protect you." Salima fell to her knees, her body shaking. "It's Kai," she blurted out, sobbing. "She is no ordinary woman. She is a ritualist. She forced me to collect her panties to steal their lives." The villagers were horrified. "Our lives?" someone exclaimed. Salima nodded, her tears falling freely. "Yes, she told me she would make me rich if I helped her. Every time I bring her the panties, she does rituals. She uses it to take their strength, their fortune, their very souls, to increase her wealth." The villagers were silent, their faces pale. "I had no choice," exclaimed Salima. "She said that if I didn't take the oath and obey her, she would kill me. I was desperate. I'm so sorry." The elder's face turned hard. He turned to the priest. "What can we do?" The priest stroked his beard thoughtfully. "We must find Kai and destroy his power. Only then can we break his control over the village." The crowd erupted in a mixture of fear and anger. What was once a celebrated trade in buckets and bowls has turned into a dark story of deceit and danger. And now, they knew the true cost of their old, discarded clothes. The priest stood up, his posture firm on the earth. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the gathered villagers. The square was so silent that even the leaves were afraid of making noise. "This is no ordinary matter," said the priest, his voice echoing. "A powerful witch lurks among us, feeding on your lives through Kai's work. But fear not, the spirits have spoken, and they will guide us to break this curse." The villagers stirred nervously. Some hugged their children, others muttered prayers under their breath. "Now," continued the priest, "if you have already given your panties to Salima, step forward. The curse cannot be lifted if you hide." For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly the women began to advance, their faces pale with fear. One by one they stood before the priest with their heads bowed, full of shame and terror. "Me too," whispered an elderly woman as she joined the line. "I gave away 3 pairs," admitted a young mother, holding her baby tightly. Soon, more women came forward until almost half the village was standing before the priest. The men watched in shock, their faces reflecting a mix of anger and fear. The priest raised his staff, drawing a circle in the earth around the gathered women. He began to sing, his voice deep and rhythmic, each word carrying the weight of ancient power. The air grew heavy, and the villagers felt a strange tug, as if the very ground beneath their feet were alive. He invoked the spirits of the earth, the river, and the heavens. The flames of the ceremonial torches flickered wildly, and a cool breeze swept across the square. The villagers shivered, even though the night was warm. As the chants grew louder, the women inside the circle began to sway, their eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, the priest's voice rose abruptly, and the circle of dust around them lit up with a faint, unearthly glow. "The curse is breaking," declared the priest, "but it will not be fully lifted until the power of Kai is destroyed." The villagers murmured in admiration, but their fear remained. They knew that the battle was not over yet. Kai, the witch behind it all, still hid in the shadows, her malevolent power threatening them. The priest, now armed with the full power of the spirits, closed his eyes and raised his staff high. Their chants became deeper, their words sharp as the blade of a hunter's knife. The air thickened, and a sudden gust of wind swept across Village Square, stirring up dust and leaves. The villagers held their breath, their eyes fixed on the priest. "She is close," declared the priest, his voice booming. "His lair is near the river, hidden under the old baobab tree." A murmur ran through the crowd. The baobab tree was a place children were warned to avoid, thought to be cursed by evil spirits. Now the truth of these ancient stories chilled their souls. "We need to end this now," said the priest. "Her power is weakening, but she is still dangerous." Led by the priest, the villagers picked up sticks, stones, and torches. Their faces were determined as they marched towards the river. The once familiar path now seemed darker, each step echoing with the weight of his mission. When they reached the baobab tree, the priest pointed his staff at the ground. "Here," he said. "Your lair is below." With a nod, the strongest men began to dig. It didn't take long for them to discover a hidden entrance, a small dark tunnel in the floor. The surrounding air was thick and fetid, exuding decay and magic. "Bring her," ordered the priest. Two brave men entered the tunnel, their torches lighting the way. Moments later, they emerged dragging a fighting figure behind them. It was Kai. His once glorious robes were now in tatters, and his face contorted in fury and fear. "Idiots!" she cried, her voice like the hiss of a snake. "You dare to defy me? You will all perish." The villagers retreated, but the priest advanced, impassive. He began to chant again, his staff lighting up with a soft light. Kai screamed, clutching her head as if the words burned her. His power was fading. One by one, the villagers invaded his lair, destroying the amulets, candles, and strange artifacts scattered around the place. Each item destroyed seemed to weaken Kai further, his screams becoming quieter. Finally, the priest raised his staff. "It is done," he said. "She is powerless." The villagers dragged Kai back to the square, where they tied her to the old tree in the center, the same place where the village once celebrated its joys. Now he was witness to his darkest trial. "You robbed us," said the old man, his voice thick with anger. "You have cursed our people. Today, your reign of terror ends." Without hesitation, the villagers picked up rocks, their fear and anger fueling their actions. The air was filled with the sound of stones hitting wood and flesh. Kai's screams echoed briefly before fading into silence. When it was all over, the villagers fell into solemn silence. The witch who caused so much suffering was no more. The air seemed lighter, and the square seemed brighter, as if the spirits themselves were relieved. The priest raised his hands. "The village is free," he declared. "But let this be a lesson. Evil thrives where greed and blindness thrive. We must remain vigilant." The villagers nodded, their hearts heavy but relieved. They won, but the memory of Kai's dark actions would haunt those closest to his plan. Salima and Tinu carried the weight of their choices. Tinu's bravery came at a cost. His vision. The morning after Kai's death, Tinu woke up in darkness. Zango's once bright world was now an emptiness, and she wept bitterly. Salima also suffered. His legs, once strong enough to carry bags of clothes, could barely support each step. His body shook under the weight of guilt. The villagers once again turned to the priest. He performed rituals, chanting and calling on the spirits. Slowly, Tinu's vision returned. She blinked, tears of gratitude streaming down her face as the village came back into view. But for Salima, the healing was not complete. Although the priest tried, his legs remained weak. She was limping. She knelt before the villagers, tears falling freely. "Please," he begged, his voice breaking. "Forgive me, I was blinded by greed and fear. I never wanted to bring harm to you all." The villagers watched in silence, some in pity, others in anger. Salima's sadness was deep, but her actions nearly destroyed them. Salima's shame was becoming too heavy to bear. Although the villagers no longer cursed her out loud, their cold gazes and whispered words haunted her at every step. She knew she couldn't stay. One morning, with nothing but a small package, Salima left Zango. She limped down the dusty road, her heart heavy. The village watched her leave, their faces a mixture of relief and sadness. His name became a lesson, a warning about what could happen when hopelessness meets dishonesty. Parents told their children about Salima, the woman who traded her security for riches. But while Salima left in shame, Tinu stayed and was celebrated. The villagers saw her as a hero. His courage in following Salima had saved everyone. Grateful, the king's son took Tinu as his wife. The village celebrated, their hearts lifted by unity. Tinu's bravery was rewarded, and she became a symbol of strength and resilience. The story of Salima and the stolen panties became a legend around campfires and under moonlit skies. The elders told the story to the children, warning them about the dangers of greed and hidden evil. "Remember," they said, "evil often comes disguised as opportunity." Although Zango returned to peace, the memory of those dark days remained. Villagers remained vigilant in the face of strange exchanges and mysterious figures. Salima's name lived on, not as a curse, but as a reminder of lessons learned. And so, The story of the woman who traded panties for riches became woven into the very essence of Zango, passed down through the generations, ensuring that the village never forgot the cost of its trust.